Hey everyone, welcome to Unlapped. I'm Nicole Briscoe. Laurence Edmondson is here too. Nate Saunders is probably out somewhere pouting. More on that in a second. Look, if you are watching us on YouTube, you know the drill. Like the video, leave a comment. Don't forget to subscribe. Of course, ESPN has a new F1 YouTube channel, so hit us up there for all things all season long Formula One. I think we need to jump off with a little bit of trash talking, don't we, Laurence? Because at least you and I were right a little bit. We ended last episode by making predictions about the race in Australia, and you and I are the only ones who scored any points. No points from Nate. None. Um,
A- a- Any opportunity to trash talk Nate, I take
exactly.
because so often he is right, annoyingly. So yeah,
And
any opportunity to get one over on him, I take.
he's not here to defend himself, so whatever, we're gonna go with it.
Exactly.
But Nate's podium was Oscar Lewis and Max, and yeah, that didn't happen because he had Max in third, and of course Max, yeah, I mean, Oscar probably should have been up there. But anyway, you and I both had Lando with the win. So our point system, for those who are new to this, including myself, is 1 point per correct driver and position, followed by if someone hits the trifecta, that's an extra 3 points. So the max we can score is 6.
The,
And you
the
and I
trifecta,
both
I just want to
got
say,
one.
normally very rarely happens. It's very rare you get all three. Especially in a season like this where we're hoping we'll have a few different types of podiums. I feel like McLaren are going to become a theme in our podium predictions, but getting that extra one is going to be tricky, I reckon, this year.
Right. I'm gonna hit them all right this weekend. Sure. All right, so we're starting a new thing this week because our producers are feeling unloved and our producers are feeling like we don't give them enough attention. So they want us to start a new segment that is like weekly producer questions. And they come up with three. I'm sure they're gonna be brilliant. And we're gonna provide brilliant answers to them. But obviously Australia was behind us now. It was great. Very few things have me excited at the time of the day that this race was on, and I had zero issues not falling asleep. Granted, I was also at work, but you know what I mean. So our producers want to know one thing, and I think this is the big thing that you and I probably both walked away from thinking, is Ferrari overhyped? We spent so much time talking about Leclerc and obviously Lewis Hamilton, and they kind of were nowhere.
On the face of it, the answer is yes, absolutely. I mean, we both got our podium predictions wrong because we put a Ferrari in
We
third
did.
place and they finished eighth and 10th. So clearly, what we expected to happen didn't pan out. Now, is it a point where we completely write Ferrari off for the whole season? I don't think so. It was a strange weekend. Friday practice, they genuinely looked like they had the fastest car. There was some questions over whether they'd be able to back it up with race pace, but in Leclerc's hands, not so much Lewis, who had a learning, a learning process throughout the weekend. But in Leclerc's hand, that car looked really, really quick. So I genuinely do think that there's something there. There's something that they got lost with in terms of their setup during the weekend. And as it got a lot hotter on Saturday, the pace dropped away. And then on Sunday, it was almost like watching the Ferrari of 2 years ago, wasn't it? All of a sudden, all these mistakes just started coming out. So a strange one for Ferrari. I want to think it is just a one-off, but I am slightly concerned that yeah, all this hype they had pre-season isn't going to manifest in
I know.
actual results.
I actually thought, like, yes, there were a few strategy calls that I was like, this feels like the mistake that they made a couple of years ago where they just pitted both cars at the same time. It was just there were a couple of interesting decisions that they made, and there was part of me that walked away from that feeling like almost they were overwhelmed by the hype and the expectations. Um, and I just wonder if that's something that's going to continue on, or if they've had their sort of like come to Jesus meeting this week and China, they're going to completely be a different team.
I feel like they will reset. I feel like there is more performance in that car. But the other thing with this Ferrari is that they've actually made quite a big change to it with the front suspension. They've almost turned it upside down. So they've gone from push rod to pull rod suspension at the front. Now, that was a decision made because they felt that there'd be a lot more performance to explore and potential within the car by doing that. But there's still a learning process, which I don't think they fully got to the end of in Bahrain testing in the 3 days they had there. Plus, you've got one of your drivers, Lewis Hamilton, coming in and learning everything fresh. And I mean, Lewis is extremely experienced and he kind of played down that this would be an issue ahead of the season and ahead of the weekend. But I think even he was a bit shocked by how far back he was on the Friday and how far ahead Leclerc was relative to him. It must be said, though, he did make progress through the weekend. It wasn't obvious on Sunday because of everything that went wrong. That pit stop call, keeping him out on slick tires, meant he briefly led the race, but then dropped back to 10th eventually. But yeah, I feel like the progress we saw there is indicative of the progress that Ferrari are going to make overall in these first few races. They've just got to hope that their rivals don't make similar progress at the same time, and they aren't just constantly playing catch up for the whole year.
So the next question is about McLaren, and they looked like an absolute rocket ship because obviously Lando got the win and Piastri was in position to be right there fighting with it as well. Is this McLaren car, is this team like, does it have the potential to be as dominant as Red Bull a couple years ago when Max won almost every single race?
If you look at certain points in the Australian Grand Prix, you would be led to think that there was points in that race, especially when Verstappen had fallen back behind Piastri and the track was drying and they were on those used intermediate tires and everybody else was struggling to keep those tires alive. But the McLarens were just 1.5 seconds faster per lap, which is an insane advantage. But that was very specific conditions. I think maybe, this time last year, if we talked about Red Bull then and the advantage they had then, we were all saying, oh God, here we've got another year of Red Bull absolutely dominating the sport. And of course, by Miami, that started to change. And by mid-season, it completely changed. And McLaren was the car that was fastest. Now, obviously, by McLaren being fastest at the start of this year, that is that trend continuing. And there is probably more logic to say that, that McLaren will keep the edge. But the other interesting thing is that McLaren themselves are still pretty wary about the advantage they seem to have in Australia, that they think it was very circuit dependent. It's, that track, you've really got to look after tires into the final sector. The McLaren was brilliant at doing that, but that's not going to be a key to performance at every track. So even going to Shanghai, a circuit where McLaren have done very well recently, and they probably will be very competitive again, but it'll be interesting to see what the gap is there. And then obviously we're going to Suzuka, another challenge again. And I feel like at the moment, from what we know, and we're limited, we're dealing with such a limited amount of data, laps, kind of, just information to get stuck into. The McLaren is clearly the quickest, but I think there's enough signs to suggest that a different type of circuit, other cars will come good. Again, going back to that earlier question, whether Ferrari have something, that they just got wrong during that Australia weekend and they can quickly fix that and then be part of it. Because again, if you go back to Friday practice in Australia, okay, there's lots of variables there, but it just didn't look as one-sided as it played out over the rest of the weekend.
It just because the weekend was so like weird, for lack of a better word. It was weird.
Yeah.
It got hotter as the weekend went on. Sunday was nothing like the previous 2 days. Sunday's race itself was almost like two different weather systems came through. And like all of those things, it's almost like we get a redo at the first race of the season if the weather in Shanghai is a little bit more neutral or at least consistent. Obviously, the rookies had a rough weekend, with the exception of Kimi Antonelli. That it was a rough weekend. It was a particularly rough weekend for Liam Lawson, which is our third producer question. Did Red Bull make the wrong decision putting Liam Lawson in that second seat? And then if they did, so it's like 3.5 questions. If they did, who should they have picked instead?
Well, this is a very easy one for me to answer because I answered it at the end of last year and I felt Yuki Tsunoda
Yes.
should have been in that seat for the start of this season. I think whoever's driving that car, it's an incredibly tough challenge to have because clearly that car's not easy to drive and clearly Max Verstappen is exceptional in everything he does. And so you're up against a very, very high bar that you've got to try and get over. So yeah, I mean, I felt from the start that Tsunoda was the choice. Having said that, I don't want to be too harsh on Liam at this stage. Like you just said, it was such a mixed weekend, so hard to get everything right and, get everything sorted from the very start. He also had an engine issue in final practice, which meant he lost, a third of his running ahead of qualifying. Yeah, there were some concerning signs, some signs that would not have looked out of place if you'd swapped his name for Sergio Perez, and how far Perez was off last year. So I'm sure we've got some Mexican listeners screaming up their YouTube channel or podcast app saying, told you so. This is exactly what Perez went through. Why would you expect it to be any different with Liam Lawson?
So we'd had this conversation about doing obviously with the Colapintos of the world sitting there like looking over their shoulders. If Liam Lawson continues to struggle, if this is a sign of things to come, how short is that leash?
Yeah, it's short. I mean, it's Red Bull. You know, we've seen this time and time again. Whether it be Max Verstappen replacing Kvyat or Alex Albon and Pierre Gasly weren't given a huge amount of opportunities to get things right, and then Perez eventually he obviously had a 2-year contract in place, and that got cut short. So we know that Red Bull will make the decision and will make a change if they feel the need to. I think the other factor in this is how well Yuki performs. And Yuki in Australia was fantastic. Okay, the end result didn't show it because he did the Ferrari strategy of staying out on
Mhm.
slick tires in the pouring rain, which is, always questionable. Perhaps if there'd been a red flag at that, period, it would have worked out beautifully and he would have, been the real hero and
But it
be
wasn't
very
like it
much
was the
knocking on.
strategy that hurt him. It wasn't him.
Yeah, it wasn't him. So I mean, and also his performance in qualifying was fantastic. It
So
was
good.
really, really good. So I think if Yuki continues to perform like that and Liam continues to struggle, then it kind of becomes obvious after a while. And I'd be surprised, there's not much for Red Bull to lose by doing it. They keep Liam in the family, they can put him down in the racing bulls. It's not like other teams, like the Doohan situation where Doohan would probably be out of F1, or almost certainly out of F1 for this season. With having the two teams, you can swap drivers, and Red Bull have always said, look, these drivers are not on a Racing Bulls contract or a Red Bull Racing contract. They're on a wider Red Bull contract, which means we can place them in either team as we see fit. So yeah, I mean, I hope Lawson's given an opportunity. I feel like we're not at that stage yet. The comments afterwards from Christian Horner were still fairly supportive. He pointed to some of the faster laps that Lawson managed to achieve in the race, all very familiar to anybody who was following Perez's season last year. But again, they gave Perez a chance until the end of the year. And then when they felt there was no other choice, they made the decision. So I think we'll see something similar. But yeah, Lawson already under pressure, and under pressure in a situation where, as I said, you're up against Max, you're up against the very best in the world. It's not easy.
It's an incredibly high bar, and I wouldn't want to be in his position. So this is a really fun time in the Formula One schedule. It's maybe not fun if you have to travel like you do week in and week out. It can be a little bit exhausting. But week 2 is coming up this weekend, and it's a move to Shanghai, as you already talked about. So it's Chinese Grand Prix, 3 o'clock in the morning, my time, if that's what you're into.
Good luck
But
with
I
that.
mean, look, China is also the first sprint race of the season, which means one less practice session. And coming off a race where every day was seemingly different, now you're throwing in a sprint race, and there are some teams that had some damage, and it's a quick turnaround. There are some teams who are essentially on their back foot going into the second race of the season. So how much does the schedule this weekend impact those teams?
I think it does. It absolutely does. I mean, we just talked about Ferrari and that understanding of the
Yeah.
car and, set up, getting lost in setup directions. They would love to have 3 bone dry practice sessions in Shanghai to get their head around the car. They're not going to get that. They're going to get one, and then it's straight into sprint qualifying, then straight into the sprint race. I mean, I suppose the advantage of sprint race is that you can still learn about the car, but at the end of it, it may be the case that, again, McLaren have taken another load of points out of Ferrari so early in the season. And so, yeah, it's a tough one for them. They can, of course, now under the regulations make setup changes between the sprint race and actual qualifying. That will be very welcome to the teams that are still struggling to fully understand their cars. But yeah, this is Formula One. It's relentless. It doesn't stop for anybody to take time and to catch their breath. That's just not the nature of it. And so that applies to teams, engineers, but also those rookie drivers. Those rookie drivers coming off a disappointing weekend, they've got to get straight back in the car, perform, hit all their marks in that first practice session to make sure they have the best possible chance going into the sprint weekend.
It really is also, like you mentioned, like the ability to put negative. It's easy to race on when you've had a good race or you've come back and you've made some gains. it's not as easy to do that when you've had a negative experience. So it really is like a test for the rookies. And we all know the ones we're talking about. Like it really is a test for them because they have to like let go of the negative stuff and get back out there and do it again. One of the things, and you're just going to have to break this down because my like mechanical mind doesn't work this way, but there are some different rules with the wing rigidity.
Yeah.
Help my little brain understand how that will come into play for the entire grid.
So the nature of the wings on a Formula One car is that they're there to produce downforce essentially. But in doing that, they have a huge amount of load that just comes from the air pressure on those wings. And that's what you're trying to create. You're trying to create that air pressure to push the car into the ground. Now, with that, inevitably, there's no substance in the world that won't bend a little bit once it has that kind of pressure on acting upon it. And so what happens essentially is that at some point, the wing elements start to flex. There's nothing you can do about it. That's natural. But it seems that some teams have taken advantage of this fact and they've looked at ways to make the wings flex to their advantage. So if the example that's been brought up ahead of the Chinese Grand Prix is on the rear wing. If you can get that rear wing to just flex a little bit once it's over a certain speed, then you'll shed a bit of downforce from that wing. Now you might think, well, why would they want to do that? On the straights, that's really helpful because with a loss of downforce, you also lose a bit of drag, which means the car goes faster along the straight. So this has become known as mini DRS. I think most fans are aware of DRS, the flap that opens in the rear wing when you overtake someone. If you have something like that acting all the time, just on a miniature element, then you will have that little advantage on straight line speed. And when we're talking about seasons where gaps in qualifying can be hundredths of a second, thousandths of a second, that can be a big advantage. And so the FIA are aware that some of the teams are perhaps creating these wings to flex. And so they have these tests where it's fairly rudimentary stuff. They just hang some weights from the wing elements and see how much they flex. And there's a tolerance. Now that tolerance for China has been made much smaller, from 2 millimeters to 0.75, which will actually go down to 0.5 after China. And basically, if they flex within that, then or if they flex beyond that, then the wing is deemed illegal. Now, it's a very quick turnaround for teams if they were doing this to make the wing stiffer. But everyone in the paddock is aware that the FIA can introduce these kind of tests at fairly short notice, and therefore they should be in some way prepared to be able to stiffen up those rear wings. But the big question, Nicole, is who will this advantage? Who was doing this that made the FIA feel like they had to act?
Do you have any idea who that is?
Anyone loses performances as well? Well, the theory, and this is a theory that mainly comes from Red Bull. Red Bull have been quite supportive of the FIA increasing flexibility tests, so making it harder for teams to get these wings flexing in this kind of way. And so the theory then is that, well, McLaren is probably the team that was playing with it the most. Last year there was some questions raised over the McLaren's wing in Baku, which was where Oscar Piastri won by a very small margin. And there was a suggestion that they were getting an advantage from having this wing that flexed slightly, this rear wing. Also at the Spanish Grand Prix it's the 9th round of this season, the FIA have already said they're going to bring in all sorts of much more stringent flexibility tests on the front wing, on elements of the rear wing as well. So this has been a battleground already, and I think it's become more of a battleground because there's no point now in developing. If you're Red Bull, there's no point in developing these flexi wings because all the regulations are going to change for next year. So your whole way you construct the wing is going to change in 2026. So if you can't beat them at it, you want to ban them from doing it. And that's what it seems like there's been a bit of pressure behind the scenes to do. So from what we understand and from what's been said and the whispers in the paddock, it seems like Red Bull are very keen for this to happen because they think it will probably slow down their main rivals, McLaren. There's some suggestion Ferrari are doing it. There's even some suggestion Mercedes have been had something on the rear wing where the rear wing kind of flexes slightly. So the proof will be in the pudding. I think often with these things, we get very excited with them before, and then it's minimal impact on on the actual event. I think the FIA are aware they don't want to, just be disqualifying all cars. So I think they're confident these teams will be able to pass the tests, but they're just saying, we've got an eye on you. We know what you're trying to do. We're just going to try and clamp down on it as much as
The
possible.
politics of all this stuff sometimes just like it's better than any soap opera that you could possibly come up with because it's
I
reality.
mean,
It's just so
it's a sport within a sport.
right.
The engineers and working at the regulations and looking for the loopholes and the
And then
areas
the
where they can gain
complaining
an
that
advantage.
wasn't me.
It's great. I mean,
So good.
it gets very complicated, and even then, I don't know if I did the best job at describing it at 7 a.m. here in Australia. But yeah, it's the thing to look out for, I guess, is straight line speeds. It'd be the obvious thing. If all of a sudden the McLaren is slightly behind some of the others, you think, oh, actually, well, maybe this has had some kind of impact on where they were running their car.
Okay, so we've sort of skirted around the issue a couple of times here, but the rookies had like that was one of the big storylines going into this season, the six rookies on the grid and like the potential for the chaos that they were going to cause. I mean, honestly, they only caused themselves chaos this last weekend in Australia, with the exception of Kimi Antonelli, who was great. Like he hardly had a wheel wrong, finished fourth, and like he did everything that they could have possibly wanted him to do. Every other rookie, though, struggled mightily, including Hadjar, who didn't even take the start. So when you look at this next weekend, is there any reason to like think that it might be different for the rookies this time, or is that sort of thing just gonna like continue to happen? Maybe not all.
Um, Yeah, I think Shanghai is a friendlier circuit for a rookie, and the conditions also look set fairly fair for the weekend. So I don't think we're going to have the wet weather. I mean, you just saw from Australia how difficult it was.
Mhm.
Just a wheel on a white line, not even the white lines at the edge of the circuit, a white line, painted line because it's
Yeah,
a road course, could send a car around. It happened to Fernando Alonso. I
it
mean,
happened to
the
Carlos
most
Sainz.
experienced driver,
Yeah,
who everyone loves to joke is a rookie, but the most experienced driver, lost the rear of his Aston Martin as a result of the conditions there. So I think that underlined and kind of gave a bit of a free pass to the drivers that did make mistakes in their rookie weekend. But yeah, I mean, for example, Oliver Behrman, that crash in practice as well, and then you lose so much time as a result of that. It really can snowball in a negative way if a driver starts making mistakes, both from time on track, but also mentally as well. So every single one of those rookies will be just looking for a clean weekend. But this is something that we talked about ahead of the season. If you're going to put rookies in there, you're going to expect mistakes. It's going to happen. But the good news is I think every single one of them looks quite exciting at some point during the weekend. I mean, do and there was some laps where you thought actually that's pretty
yeah.
competitive compared to Pierre Gasly. Bortoleto looked very impressive, out qualified Nico Hulkenberg. Isaac Hadjar looked very good in qualifying. Obviously, didn't make it past the formation lap, but that's so easy to do. That just twitch from the rear of the car. These cars have 1,000 brake horsepower. The tires get too cold, and then you're trying to control all of that with your right foot. With all these systems on the car that
They get
deliver
torqued
torque
too
in
at the
different
lows.
ways.
Yeah.
So easy to do.
Yeah, and that the other thing that it wasn't just like the circuit itself had so many extra lines painted on it because of all the bike lanes that, like you said, it's street circuits, like all
Yeah.
of those things were put in. So it wasn't just like the actual track, it was just the fact that this was on the road. And you saw it almost happen to Antonelli. I mean, they got on the radio at one point when he was like, "Yeah, that almost happened to me." But like, like you said, if it happened to Fernando Alonso, if it happened to Carlos Sainz, who we all know, like is really good in the wet, it was like it almost made it somewhat forgivable to have
Yeah,
all
it
the,
did.
yeah, right. Speaking of Sainz, I mean, Williams had a very good weekend. In the end, Albon ended up finishing fifth. There was that conversation there, fourth, fifth. There was the penalty that was rescinded on Antonelli, but they ended up fifth. Sainz obviously had the crash before the end of the opening lap. So they had they showed potential. And Racing Bulls, they had potential as well. When you look at the upcoming weekend, which team do you feel more confident in?
It's a tough question because we're still at that stage where we don't really know the strengths and weaknesses of either
Mhm.
car. And I feel like both of them have overperformed from where we expected them to be probably going into the season. It was clear in testing that the Williams was quite special. But the Racing Bulls as well, that's just an example of, I think, where those guys midway through last year just found some solutions, some ways forward with the car, and that's followed into this year. So I would say again, it comes down to the drivers as to who's going to outperform and who's going to be knocking on the door of those top four teams. And with Carlos Sainz and Alex Albon, you've got two very, very good drivers who, with the exception of Sainz's mistake, which apparently was because he'd put the car into the safety car mode, and that meant that when he changed gear, it delivered a different amount of torque through the rear
Right.
wheels. And so he just hadn't experienced that because he'd moved from Ferrari to Williams over the winter. He just hadn't experienced that at any point. So it just caught him completely by surprise as he went to pull a gear through that corner on a white line or a painted white line and went round. So I don't expect that to happen against Sainz. I think he would learn that lesson, and we don't expect it to rain anyway in Shanghai. So I think, again, we'll see him performing very well. There were points in the weekend in Australia where he looked exceptionally quick, especially in practice. So I think with those two drivers, you'd give them the edge. But again, Yuki's on a mission, isn't he? Yuki's on a mission to take that
Wouldn't
seat
you
off
be?
Liam. So
I would be.
if, yeah, absolutely. And so I think that guy, when he's fired up, when he's got something to prove, and of course he's got a point to prove beyond just Red Bull because he's
Mhm.
looking maybe next year to move out of the Red Bull family. Then I think he's going to be in the mix as well. Isaac, I'm not going to put too much pressure on him. Rookie in F1, I think just
Yeah.
looking to just get comfortable again after what happened in Australia. So perhaps Isaac Hadjar maybe slightly off the pace of those guys, but those three, it should be a great battle. And then really you're looking at the last few points on offer that they're going to be fighting over, because you'd expect the Ferraris, Mercedes, Red Bulls, McLarens of this world to be filling the top eight, but we'll see how that goes.
It's funny because like if you had somebody in the car at Racing Bulls besides Yuki, like who wasn't a rookie, it would be a more interesting sort of like conversation. But if Sainz and Albon just do almost like the minimum of what they can do, then it does feel like it's more slanted towards the Williams in that conversation. There are obviously a number of teams who were really excited to get out of Australia, and there are probably some teams who were happy that they had the experience that they did. So, like, if you look at this weekend, who is a team or a driver who's like most excited to just peace out Australia, let's go to China?
I think Lewis is very excited to get back on track. I mean, we talked a bit about Ferrari and how clearly they're on a bit of a journey with this car, but within that, Lewis is on a journey himself to get the most from it. And the enthusiasm's still there, even after that race on Sunday. If that had been in the Mercedes last year, I think we would have had a few, very, very short answers from Lewis about what happened in the race. He was still engaging. He still had a smile on his face.
Yeah.
I think he's still very keen to prove what he can do. And I think also when he looks at the whole weekend, even if he didn't get the result, he got a single point at the end of it. But I think when he looks at his performance versus Leclerc, he could see improvements just getting slightly closer, slightly closer. The area where he was really struggling was in high speed corners. So 910 was a good example of that, where he just didn't have the same level of confidence as Leclerc in those high speed corners, wasn't able to commit on the same level. So that will be the key thing to look out for is, if Lewis is making progress, it will be in the high speed corners. There aren't that many in Shanghai, but there's that kind of middle sector. There's a few. So yeah, keep an eye on the speed traces through there, just seeing what kind of advantage Leclerc has over Hamilton will be really interesting. But I think he's got the most ceiling above him to improve into. And obviously the motivation is still undoubtedly there for Lewis to do so. So I'd say he's probably the most likely one to make another step.
You know how we were talking last week about like Max can just drive a shoebox and like Max can
Yeah.
make the most out of like anything. I was sort of laughing in the middle of the race as we were like watching it happen. And like Max is, oh, we're not going to be in contention to fight for the win, blah, blah, blah. And even with most of us thinking the McLaren is like a rocket ship, where was Max? For the majority of the race, he was right there. And for the majority of the race, especially like that last lap, he was giving chase. And it's like, again, it's like, it can't be that bad, or he's just that talented.
I think he is, it's a bit of both, but he is so exceptionally talented. And in those conditions, everything in my brain was saying the McLaren is the faster car, the McLaren is the better car.
Yes.
Lando is a very good driver in himself, but there was another part of me which was saying Max is going to get him. He's going to find him. He's going to, find a way past. Didn't quite
Especially
happen
when
in the
Lando
end.
had that little bobble, the tiniest bobble on, I think it was the last lap or the second to last lap.
Yeah,
And like turn 5, turn 6, somewhere in there.
turn
Lando
six,
had
yeah.
the smallest bobble, and like you just were like, is that enough momentum to really let him close the gap? Like,
And we know what Max can do. I mean,
right.
2021 Abu Dhabi, the obvious example where he overtook Lewis, I think, earlier on that final lap than anybody expected him to do it. So yeah, with Max, you've always got options, haven't you, as a team? There's always a possibility that he's going to put you back in the fight, and that must be such a nice feeling for Red Bull right now, because definitely that car isn't exactly where they want it. I think it is probably a little bit better than a lot of people expected. But yeah, when you put Max behind the wheel, he just makes up the difference. And I'm glad you brought it up, actually, because I feel like we haven't really touched on Max, and that
Yeah,
was an exceptional performance again.
we haven't talked about him, which is kind of nice because I'm sure that there are a couple of times throughout the season we'll be like, oh my God, we have to talk about Max again. Um, I just I just pulled out the trusty pencil. It has a little bit of an eraser so that I can make changes. We're gonna get Nate on the line and we'll lock in his answers before the start of the race. But it is time to make predictions again for this coming week. I'm gonna let you go first. I'm gonna write this down too. Um, you want to go first, second, third, third, second, first?
I'll go third, second, first,
And
and
I just want you to know, mine, I already wrote it down, so I'm not going to
oh
change it
wow,
based on what you say.
okay, okay.
Okay.
So yeah, I'm going to go predictable because I'm just trying to bank some points early on. I might
Okay.
might
All
get a
right.
bit more exciting later on. So I'm going to go with Max Verstappen in third place,
Okay.
Oscar Piastri in second place, Lando Norris in first. Is that the same as you, Nicole?
It's
Because if
literally,
it is, I might change it.
it's literally, no, you can't change it. That's what you
Okay.
wanted. That is literally what I have. Because I thought, like, you can make all the arguments that you want about like McLaren, who's better, who's faster. But I do think, like we talked about it a little bit before, when you learn to win, when you learn to deal with the stress, the pressure of championship expectations and race winning expectations, like we watched Lando go through that last year. And so he has matured in that way. And now this year, he does have the car under him from moment one. So like I just don't see a situation where there's a reason to doubt him until he gives us a reason to doubt him. And Piastri was there the entire race. And yeah, they both made mistakes, but look at the way Lando recovered. And Oscar recovered too, but like not in the way that Lando did. So I don't think that that's going to happen again. So that's why I'm going the 1-2 McLaren. And again, just Max because it's Max. And I think Max is sort of like the Kansas City Chiefs. You're going to go with them until somebody can beat them. And I'm
Yeah.
waiting for, in my opinion, this weekend it could be either one of the Mercedes drivers or it could be Ferrari. But until that happens, I don't know. I don't want to go against him because
Yeah, I mean, I was
we
very
can.
tempted to say Oscar to win instead of Lando, just because I think, he's going to have a real fire in his belly after what happened
Right.
in Australia and a desire to get ahead. But Lando did just, the whole weekend he just looked that little bit further ahead of Oscar. And yeah, I just feel like Oscar's going to have to do something super special to start beating Lando if everything goes to plan.
Thinking about the championship last year and when watching sort of like Lando go through some of the back and forth with his friend, and Max and have some of the stuff play out on the track and have some of that, going on. It was hard. You watched Lando struggle. When it comes to your own teammate being the one to do that, how is he going to handle that? And that's the only thing that makes me really question Lando, where it's like I don't know. It remains to be seen. Anyway,
And it's I mean, just on that as well, like how McLaren deal with that, because we saw
right.
already in Australia them implement team orders midway through the race to say hold position. Now, I was pretty disappointed by that because so much of what McLaren had said going into the weekend was we're going to let our drivers race. They have to be respectful. They have to not crash into each other, but we're going to let them race. And then we get into that point midway through and they called off the racing. They gave reasons for it. They said that the two drivers were coming up ahead of into traffic, into cars they had to lap. They said that they could see tiny little mistakes from both drivers because they were pushing so hard. And obviously the conditions were pretty messy out there. So they didn't want to potentially throw away a 1-2, but I thought that was interesting already. At this stage, they already felt the need to cool off Oscar as he was closing down on Lando, looking faster than Lando at that point. So how that develops as well, whether these little kind of moments snowball into something a bit bigger because Oscar will say, well, you did that for Lando in Australia, why aren't you doing it for me now? That's going to be interesting over the year as well. So exactly. I think McLaren, as brilliant as their situation is right now, because they're in the position every team wants to be in, which is having the fastest car and two very competitive drivers. That it's might also
filled with landmines. Filled with landmines for them.
Exactly.
So before we let you go, because I know that you actually have a flight to catch, so I can't keep you forever. One of the craziest rumors this week is actually about Bangkok getting a potential race. What are you hearing?
Yeah, so Stefano went to visit the Prime Minister actually in Thailand and talk about the possibility of a Bangkok street race. This is a very real possibility, and actually after F1's slightly cooled on the idea of racing in Rwanda, I think the Thailand Bangkok street race idea is actually one of the ones at the top of the list. That's not to say that it's a done deal or they're already making space in the calendar. But I think it is a very, very serious proposition. I personally think it would be great. F1 being in Southeast Asia would be fantastic. We used to have the Malaysian Grand Prix. We had the Vietnamese Grand Prix that never happened. That kind of fell apart after or during COVID in 2020. It was meant to be on the calendar, but then all sorts of reasons meant that it never, ever came back. So I'd love to see another race in that part of the world. And I think Thailand would be a really fun place to go. Of course, Red Bull have their links to Thailand as well. It's half owned essentially by Thais. So I think there's a lot to suggest that will happen. But as with all these things, it's fragile negotiations. It's it's a lot of money that needs to change hands. So we'll see where it goes. But yeah, hopefully in the near future we could be talking about a Thai Grand Prix.
All right. Well, I know you have a flight to catch. You have a busy week in front of you. Let's try to get your SportsCenter issues fixed, though, too.
Yes.
Tried to have Sky on SportsCenter with me before the race the other night, and we were trying to talk to each other through tin cans. It just wasn't working. So we'll get that worked out. I will talk to you throughout the week, though. And then remember, if you are watching, leave a comment, hit us up with a 5-star review, subscribe to the new ESPN F1 YouTube channel for your F1 content all throughout the season. And we'll see you again next week after China. Safe travels.